statements when segment information is provided. They can better understand performance, better assess risk and returns, and make more informed judgments about the enterprise as a whole. In single financial reports contains both consolidated and separate parent financial statements, whereas segment information is required to be presented according to AS 17. Segment information need only be presented on the basis of the consolidated financial statement. Define business segment as per AS 17. A distinguished component of an enterprise providing a product, service, or group of related product services that is subject to risks and returns different from other business segments. List three factors that should be considered in determining if products or services are related for the purpose of defining a business segment. Nature of the product services, nature of production processes, and the type of class of customers. Define geographical segment as per AS 17 and distinguish components of our enterprise providing products or services within a particular economic environment that is subject to risk and return different from components in other environment. What are two factors considered when identifying geographical segment under AS 17? Similarity of economic and political conditions and special risk and associate with operations in a particular area. A geographical segment under AS 17 can be based on either the location of an enterprise assets or the location of its customers. What is normally the basis for identifying an enterprise's segment under AS 17? The organizational structure of the enterprise and its internal financial reporting system. What is the term for a business or geographical segment for which AS 17 required information to be disclosed? A reportable segment. What three components make up segments revenue under AS 17? Directly attributable revenue, a reasonably allocated portion of enterprise revenue, and revenue from transactions with other segments. Name two items that are specifically excluded from segment revenue under AS 17 unless the segment is primarily of a financial nature. Interest or dividend income and gains on sale of investments of extinguishment of debt. What three components make up segment expense under AS 17? Directly attributable operating expense, a reasonably allocated portion of enterprise expense, and expense from transactions with other segments. Name two types of expenses that are specifically excluded from segment expense under AS 17. Income tax expense and general administrative head office expense that relate to enterprise as a whole. Under what condition can costs incurred at the enterprise level be considered part of segment expense? If they relate to segments operating activities and can be directly attributable or allocated on a reasonable basis. How segment result calculated according to AS 17? It is calculated as segment revenue less segment expense. What constitutes segment assets under AS 17? Operating assets employed by a segment in its operating activities that are directly attributable or can be reasonably allocated to the segments. What constitutes segments? What type of assets is explicit excluded from the definition of segment assets in AS 17, income tax assets? What constitutes segment liabilities under AS 17? Operating liabilities from a segment's operating activities that are directly attributable or can be reasonably allocated to the segment. What type of liabilities is explicit excluded from the definition of segment liabilities in AS 17? Income tax liabilities. Under what circumstance should interest expense be included as part of segment expense for a non-financial segment? When the interest is excluded as a part of the cost of inventories as required by AS 16 and AS 2. What governs whether an enterprise primary segments reporting format will be business segments or geographical segments? The dominant source and nature of enterprise risk and returns. If an enterprise risk and returns are predominantly affected by difference in its products, its primary reporting format should be dash segment, business segments. What is the first quantitative threshold for identifying a reportable segments based on revenue? Its total revenue, external and internal, is 10% or more of the total revenue of all segments. What is the quantitative threshold for identifying a reportable segments based on assets? Its segments assets are 10% or more of total assets of all segments. Explain the segments result test of identifying a reportable segment under AS 17. A segment is reportable if its result is 10% or more of the greater of the combined result of the profitable segments or the combined result of all loss-making segments in absolute amount. What happens if the total external revenue of all identified reportable segments is less than 75% of total enterprise revenue? Additional segments must be identified as reportable even if they don't meet the 10% threshold until at last 75% of total enterprise revenue is included. A segment was reportable in the immediately preceding period but no longer meets the 10% threshold limit. What is the requirement under AS 17 for the current period? It should be continued to be reportable segment for the current period. What are the first three disclosures requirements for each reportable segments under the primary reporting format in AS 17? Segment revenue split between external or internal factors, segments, segment results, and total carrying amount of segment assets. Besides assets, what other balance sheet items must be disclosed for each reportable segments under the primary reporting format? The total amount of segment liabilities. What disclosure is required for capital expenditure in the primary reporting format under AS 17? The total cost incurred during the period of acquired segment assets expected to be used for more than one period, tangible and intangible fixed assets. What must be enterprise present to link the information for reportable segments to the aggregate information in the enterprise financial statements? A reconciliation for segment revenue, segment results, segment assets, and segment liabilities. If an enterprise primary format is business segments, what secondary information must it reports for geographical segments exceeding the 10% revenue threshold? It must report segments revenue from external customers by geographical areas based on the location of its customers. If the primary format is business segment, what secondary information about assets must be disclosed geographically? The total carrying amount of segment assets by geographically location for each segments whose assets are 10% or more of total geographical assets. If an enterprise primary format is geographical segment, what secondary information must it reports for each significant business segments? Segment revenue from external customers, the total carrying amount of segment assets, and the total cost of acquiring long-term segment assets. On what basis should inter-segment transfer be measured and reported under AS17? They should be measured on the basis that the enterprise actually used to price those transfers. What must be disclosed regarding the pricing of inter-segment transfer? The basis of pricing inter-segment transfer and any change in that basis should be disclosed in the financial statements. If an enterprise changes an accounting policies for segment reporting, such as the basis of for allocating expenses, what must be disclosed? The nature of the change and its financial effect, if reasonably determinable. Under AS17, an enterprise should be indicate the types of products and services included in each reported segment, business segment. When calculating segment assets to apply the 10% threshold test, how should deferred tax assets be treated? They should be excluded as segment assets, do not include income tax assets. A company produces automobile batteries and UPS batteries. Why might be considered two separate business segments under AS17? Because the risks and returns are affected by different factors. Example, government policies versus power conditions, making them distinguished segments. The 10% revenue test for identifying a reportable segment considers revenue from the sales to external customers and revenue from transactions with dash other segments. The overall 75% test of reportable segment consider only dash revenue to compute the threshold limit. External. Can management design a segment as reportable even if it does not meet any of the 10% quantitative thresholds? Yes, a segment may be designed as a reportable segment at the discretion of the management of the enterprise. Under AS17, segments information should be prepared in conformity with dash adopted for preparing and presenting the financial statements of the enterprise as a whole. Accounting policies. If a segment operations are primarily of a financial nature, that items normally excluded are included in its segments revenue and expense. Interest and dividend, income expense, and gain loss on sale of investments. What is the purpose of reconciling segment data to enterprise financial statements? To explain the difference between the sum of the segments information and the consolidated enterprise totals. Which entities are mandatorily required to comply with AS17? Non-SMCs, small and medium-sized companies, and Level 1 entities in the case of non-corporates. A single business segment does not include products and services with significantly differing dash and dash risks and returns. When are jointly used assets and liabilities are called two segments under AS17, they are allocated if and only if their related revenues and expenses are also allocated to those segments.